So I'm Stan Allen. I'm an architect and a teacher. I also write quite a bit. I have never identified myself as a theorist. I mean, for me, writing is a parallel practice to architecture. And when I write from the point of view of an architect, and I teach from the point of view of an architect. In a curious way, I sort of fell into it accidentally when I was an undergraduate. In the American system, you don't have to decide what you're going to study before you go to university. And as a sort of naive freshman, I had actually made a mistake on my schedule, and I needed an extra class at the last minute. And somebody suggested I take an architectural history class. So, and those classes at Brown University were taught by a very charismatic professor called William Geordie. I mean, he was a very straight historian, a little bit dry, but his classes were very engaging. And the other thing that he did, in fact, it was a class on 19th century American architecture. And it sort of connected with a lot of elements in my past. You know, the architecture of New England woolen mills, for example, or the shingle-style buildings in Newport, Rhode Island, which were close to Providence, where Brown is. So it was the kind of thing where, through Geordie's architectural history classes, I discovered something that sort of was always there, but never really had been directly expressed. Coming from my particular pathway, which is very specific to the American system, so I had 4 years undergraduate at Brown University, and that consisted in several different things. I think like many young students, I had a preconception that in order to study architecture, you needed to be really good at math and you needed to draw really well. I discovered you didn't have to be that good at math. My math was sufficient, and I think the sort of preconception, I think, for many young people is that architecture is primarily a technical profession. And because I was introduced to architecture through a kind of art historical lens, and then also just kind of connecting into the sort of landscape that I knew, I began to see it in a somewhat different way. The other advantage to Brown University was that it was possible to take classes at the Rhode Island School of Design. So my first design classes were at Rhode Island School of Design. And then, I mean, to be quite honest, I was rather impatient and wanted to dive into architecture a little bit more than the sort of combined context of Brown and RISD made possible. So I came down to New York City in 1978 to the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. So at that point, I was thrown into not necessarily a school of architecture, because the Institute was a kind of think tank with an undergraduate school attached, but not a professional school of architecture, but really sort of thrown into the middle of the New York architecture scene in the late 1970s. And I don't, was it, I mean, I can't say it met my expectations or didn't meet my expectations, because I had no clue that it had existed before I encountered it, really, Well, sure. I mean, I think, particularly as you get older, the different places get layered onto one another. So I do make a point, which is, very much a kind of distant origin at this point. But I was actually born in Colorado. My family moved east when I was a teenager. But that, I still feel that sort of sense of connection to the sort of open landscapes of the West and the mountains. I mean, I think that's very sort of basic from childhood. And then, I grew up in Western Massachusetts in a university town, and that's what I was sort of referring to with the kind of New England landscapes of wooden structures from the 18th and 19th century, and the mill towns, the abandoned factory buildings. By again, by the 1970s, all of those buildings were abandoned. So you walk around Lowell, Massachusetts, you were walking around ruins. And there was something, I think, quite kind of poignant about that. But then, of course, I was 21 years old when I moved to New York City. I mean, I went down to go to school, never left. And that sense of the culture of the city, particularly in those days, I arrived in New York City in fall of 1977, which summer of 1977 was the famous Summer of Sam. So, this was New York City when it was a very weird, edgy place, and that was the landscape of my student years in New York, really. Cities like New York, and I think a lot of other major cities are now they resemble one another much more than they did. We're talking 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, 50 years ago almost, So, I think that the kind of specificity of the local culture and the differences between neighborhoods and also the sort of the art and architecture worlds were small at that time. Peter Eisenman would bring basically all of the New York architects and also all the visiting Europeans would all come through the Institute, from Tafuri to Philip Johnson and Michael Graves, Aldo Rossi, John Haydick, everybody was circulating through the Institute. And I just don't think, I don't think you have that kind of access these days. I mean, it was just a smaller world, Well, yeah, and again, to kind of continue that story. So from the Institute, I went to the Cooper Union. And because I had an undergraduate degree from Brown, I entered, which was unusual at Cooper Union, I entered with advanced standing and ended up spending 3 years there instead of 5. So I entered a professional architecture program at Cooper Union in 1978. Of course, the figure of John Haydick looms large in that context. And I had a rather ambivalent relationship with Haydick, I would say. For one thing, Cooper in those years, well, it's complicated actually, because it was a moment of transition at Cooper Union during that period of time. I would say from what had been established in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a kind of neo-Corbusian approach, very, very formally driven with the 9-square grid exercise in the first year. And, John Haydick doing classes on collage and cutouts, and Bob Slutsky teaching color theory. Very coherent program in a way. By the late 1970s, that was kind of breaking up a little bit. So that was the period, the influence of Raymond Abraham was becoming stronger on the school. There was actually a split between Haydick and Slutsky, where actually over John Haydick inviting Aldo Rossi to the school. To Bob Slutsky, Aldo Rossi represented postmodernism and anti-modernism, and he said he had enough, and he moved over and started teaching painting instead of architecture. So that was the period of time that I was at Cooper, and it was very much in flux. But Haydick, still, very charismatic teacher. Haydick was a teacher who he taught indirectly. He would never say, do this, do that, or look at this or look at that. He would make some kind of, metaphorical statement, and as a student, you sort of had to figure it out, And frankly, I was kind of an outsider because I had entered as a transfer student. And John Haydick was also very, very invested. The history of the Cooper Union, going back to the 19th century, as a school that offered free education, was directed at students who didn't necessarily come from privileged backgrounds. So, I was this kid coming from an Ivy League school, entering in the middle of the program. He never sort of tried to quite trust me. So my relationship with Hayek was I would say rather ambivalent. I was also, having come from a liberal arts background and then having spent a year at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, again, you have to remember the late 1970s were a period when we all sort of became aware of kind of European theory, and Hayek was also quite suspicious of that as well. So, and I was also a little bit skeptical, again, of some of the sort of vague metaphysical language that Hayek would use. So, all of which is a very long-winded way of saying that Hayek did have a big impact on me. And he also, I think he ultimately, basically, if you made beautiful work, Hayek would get on your side. So, I think he'd got over some of his original suspicion of me. And with time, I've also just, and a little bit of distance from the personal contact with Hayek, seeing, in other words, understanding and seeing Hayek through his work rather than as a kind of charismatic personal figure, I think has allowed me to get closer to the point where I would say he is a kind of mentor, or even a maestro. The other thing, again, just to stay on that moment in time for a while, and the kind of uncertainty of Cooper. Hayek had invited people. He invited some really interesting people to the school. Among them, Bernard Tschumi, for example, who at that time, this is Bernard Tschumi before La Villette. I think he was actually teaching at Cooper when he won the La Villette competition. So at that time, Bernard Tschumi, whose work I had sort of known from exhibitions, and also he was associated with the Institute as well. He was a kind of figure who was somewhere between the worlds of architecture and conceptual art. So he was teaching at Cooper, and again, not quite fitting into the kind of existing sort of ethos of the school. There was a very interesting guy called P. Adam Sitney, who is a historian and critic of experimental film. So you had a lot of interesting people coming through and feeding the culture of that school at that time. So I think the first person that I would identify as a major influence is certainly Hayek. Cooper Union, for example, you didn't read theory, but you read novels, right? And in addition to P. Adam Sitney coming in and talking about the experimental films of Stan Brakhage and Jonas Mekas, you had David Shapiro teaching poetry classes, and we're reading John Ashbery. And I've always turned to novels actually for and I think coming out of that as well, film. So I don't know, a figure like Wim Wenders for me, for example, is somebody that's had a been a kind of constant presence. The other thing I should probably also mention is that I'm married to an artist. So in that entire period, I was sort of living day to day. With one foot in the art world and one foot in the architecture world. So, our closest friends are painters and sculptors more than architects. And there are a lot of painters that I look to constantly and feel that there's a kind of dialogue. People like Gary Steffen, Jonathan Lasker. There's a wonderful painter called Tom Niskowski that was a good friend who passed away a couple of years ago. So that's been a kind of constant presence. So I do this, sort of hybrid undergraduate degree at Brown with courses at RISD and the Institute. I wrote a senior thesis jointly with Bill Geordie and Ken Frampton. Then I enter the Cooper Union in the middle of the program and finish up. So I finished in 1981, and I went out to work at that point. I worked for a year and a half for Richard Meyer, which, at that point was, considered one of the really rigorous high design offices. I learned a lot. I mean, I worked on the Frankfurt Museum, the High Museum of Art, and a museum in Des Moines, Iowa. So, Meyer had interesting work. He was working internationally. There were a lot of Germans in the office. And it was a very young office. I mean, I was, 22, 23, right out of school. But, the associates were 28 years old, and they were running big projects. So, the thing about Meyer, I was paid very badly. He looked at my portfolio. He could see that I could draw. I had no experience in doing working drawings whatsoever, but he knew that I could draw, and if it took me twice as long to figure out how to make a working drawing, it didn't matter because he was only paying me half as much as what you would make at a bigger office. So. And that was the thing, basically you sort of paid a premium to work in a high design office. You could make more money going to work for SOM, but if you wanted to work for somebody like Meyer, you made less. But I learned a lot actually in that context. So I worked there for about a year and a half, 2 years, and it was at that point that I had met Moneo at the Institute. Actually, he was one of those Europeans who had passed through the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. And I wrote to him and didn't hear back for 6 months, figuring, fine, this is not going to happen. And I get this letter from him saying, can you come next week? Basically, I think they had a big charrette in the office and they needed people. So anyway, we go back and forth a little bit, and I packed up and moved to Madrid in 1983, I think that was, which of course, through no great planning on my part, turned out to be a brilliant time to be in Madrid. That was the years of I'm blanking. La movida madrilena, with Almodovar and these artists and architects, and it was a brilliant time. It was a really brilliant time. I'd been intrigued by Moneo's work. It was somewhat arbitrary to choose to go to Madrid. Again, in retrospect, turned out to be a very interesting time to be in Madrid. Nobody knew anything about Spanish architecture at that time. Before 1992, Spanish architecture in this country was almost completely unknown. Again, I sort of, by pure luck, landed in Moneo's office at an interesting moment. So they were working on the competition for the Atocha station when I arrived. I worked on the museum in Mérida, but more, the structure of the museum was complete. I worked on the proyecto de montaje for the installation of the collection. Worked on a number of different smaller buildings. And then it was at the end of that period when Moneo was invited to the GSD as chair. So the last thing I did in that office actually was to help Moneo put together a dossier of work for the chairmanship at Harvard. So yeah, that was another, again, I think fairly formative period, and I'm still quite close to Raphael, and have again, it's a complex relationship. I mean, the work I do doesn't look anything like Moneo's work. But I think what I learned from Moneo was much more, well, I would say, two things. I mean, more than two things, of course, but I think in the more general sense, just simply a kind of approach to making the work, and Moneo's insistence on taking every project on its own terms and not imposing a preconceived idea on a project. I mean, having watched that process unfold, I think that was very, very important. Just the way in which you study and develop a project, which I think was very particular to that office. I think, and also, I mean, I think Moneo is also, for me, a kind of exemplary figure of somebody who combines a writing practice with an architectural practice, his sort of thoughtfulness as an architectural thinker, I think was quite important to me as well. One more thing about that, which again, became important to me later on, was people I met in Spain at that time. So Iñaki Ábalos, Juan Herreros, Emilio Toñón, Luis Mencia, all these people that I've stayed in touch with. So, and that's allowed me to have a kind of ongoing conversation, I think, with the architects in Spain as well. So again, as I said, it was a convoluted path that I took. Actually, I came back to graduate school here at Princeton after the time I had spent in Spain. So I was out of school for 3 or 4 years, and came back and did what is in the United States a 1.5 year post-professional master's program here at Princeton. And that again was a slightly odd time. It was the sort of tail end of postmodernism. Michael Graves actually was still a pretty strong voice here at the School of Architecture. It was the period when he was working on the Whitney Museum, and so the design side at Princeton was still very heavily indebted to postmodernism and sort of historical reference, but they had hired a group of young theorists and historians. So it was actually here at Princeton in the late 1980s, 85, 86, that I met people like Beatrice Colomina, Michael Hayes, and Mark Wigley, who were all teaching here in those years. In fact, the journal Assemblage was launched when Michael Hayes was a young teacher here at Princeton. So that was a very funny moment when I basically came back to graduate school, on the one hand, having already been out in the field and worked, and already having a professional degree from Cooper Union. But again, it was the sort of heady days of the theory of the 1980s. And I wanted to be at the place where that was happening. And because of the presence of Colomina, Wigley, and Hayes, Princeton was that. So, but there was a huge divide between, Michael Graves doing postmodernism in the studios and Mark Wigley and Michael Hayes and Colomina, talking about, European cultural theory, and, later Wigley being involved with deconstructivism. So it was a kind of tense period of time at the school, actually, but actually in funny ways quite beneficial. People like Sarah Whiting and Greg Lynn were my classmates at that time. So, we in some ways, having a kind of intellectual conflict playing itself out at a school can actually be a good experience for the students. So it wasn't until after that basically at that point, I was, what has become a fairly, at least in the US, a fairly conventional strategy. I was actually already a registered architect because of the time that I'd worked in the field. I mean, it's a very funny story where actually my first week of graduate school at Princeton, I got a call from my wife on the payphone upstairs in the studios, which was how you communicated in those pre-cell phone days. And she says, "There's an envelope here with your results from your architecture exams." And I said, "Well, why don't you open it?" So she opens it up, says, "You passed everything." And so, I was a registered architect, even though I was just starting my graduate program here. And, first person I saw was Tony Vidler. And I said, "Tony, I just got the news that, I passed all my exams. I'm a registered architect." And patted me on the shoulder and says, "Don't worry, we won't tell anyone." So, when I graduated from Princeton, I was able to start teaching. Actually, initially at Rhode Island School of Design, and then later Moneo brought me to the GSD because he was still in place as it was his final years as chair. And like many young architects in the U.S., that gave me enough of a steady source of income, so I was able to start my practice. And the first projects I did, again, because of my sort of art world connections, I did a series of art galleries in New York City. None of them exist anymore. It's a bit the nature of that business, but it was a nice way to start a practice. And because you were working with clients in the visual arts and, basically renovating ground floor interior spaces in Soho for gallery space. Well, yeah, the prehistory to that is a little bit later in that the same time. But yeah, so I taught at Harvard for a year, and then in 1989 I took a position at Columbia. So the 13 years I was at Columbia, again through no great planning on my own on my own part, just turned out to be a very interesting time at Columbia. So because I had met Bernard Tschumi many years before that when he was teaching at Cooper, and we had stayed in touch. So Tschumi invited me to teach at Columbia, and he, Bernard brought to Columbia a teaching philosophy and a sort of educational philosophy that came almost entirely from his experience at the AA with Alvin Boyarsky, which is that you hire a lot of smart, talented young people, you give them a lot of space to work, and you also you set them up in competitive relationships with one another, and that creates a kind of dynamic school, and that really happened at Columbia in the early 1990s. Greg Lynn, Bernard, Hani Rashid. You had the older faculty, people like Ken Frampton and Stephen Hall, who sometimes were not very happy with what the young faculty were doing. Jesse Reiser came a little bit later. Neil was Neil's a little older than I am, and Neil, he might have gone to the West Coast already by that time. Neil and I never overlapped at Columbia, actually. Neil taught before Bernard came. I think he'd already gone to the West Coast by then. I knew Neil when he was living in New York in the 80s, but he was already gone. And then, you had people like Jeff Kipnis coming through, Catherine Ingram teaching, again. And then, of course, in the middle 1990s, when Tschumi made this very, very conscious effort to bring computers into the design studio. And Bernard took a slightly different, again, this is, people don't realize in retrospect, but, before that time, computers were, first of all, it's very, again, you in order to work in architecture and the computer in the 1980s, you almost had to learn coding. It was very slow and cumbersome and had very little to do with design. I mean, offices by that time, a big office like SOM was already producing working drawings with AutoCAD, but it was purely, kind of technical operation to streamline the production of working drawings. It had nothing to do with design, right? So it was in the, 94, 95 that Bernard started introducing Macintosh computers running Form Z, and then there were always a couple of machines, first of all running Softimage, and then later Maya that Greg Lynn monopolized. So you had this very dynamic situation with young faculty who were in conversation with one another. We none of us had a lot of work. We were all doing competitions and sort of sharing the sort of information about what we were doing, and working with students. And it was sort of out of that the initial field conditions piece came, the infrastructural urbanism piece that you mentioned, and that was what in turn led to the collaboration with Jim Corner. So it was in the late 1990s that Jim Corner and I started working together. And interestingly enough, the original field conditions work didn't relate directly to landscape. So it was really through my contact with Jim Corner that I started getting interested in landscape. Their approach was unconventional within the landscape world. To talk about self-organizing systems and to talk about infrastructure, to talk about very large scale. I mean, of course, Jim Corner was a student of Ian McHarg's, and McHarg had been talking about, this kind of thing. McHarg is sort of his work was even instrumental in the creation of GIS. So Jim brought that sense of large scale operations, of mapping. We were influenced by Schumi and Kohlhaas and the La Villette competition. I mean, the La Villette competition in 1983 was really the first time that sort of large-scale architectural expertise was addressing a problem of a landscape that would develop over time, a large distressed landscape at the periphery of a city that needed to incorporate many different agents and to develop over time. So I think in many ways the La Villette competition is another important piece of the puzzle in the development of landscape urbanism. That I had gotten to that through my contact with Schumi to some extent. So the ground was prepared, I think, and it when Jim and I started working together in '99, it was sort of logical that he was Jim also. I mean, there's another connection I think which is quite important, which is the use of surface modeling in the computer as it relates to the sort of soft surfaces of landscape. So that was another important point of contact as well. And I think the other important thing about the discussion with Jim was becoming more and more aware of ecological theories and ecological succession and thinking about the life of landscapes and cities in time. And it was in fact, so there's an important intermediate step, which is the conference and book called Landform Building, right around 2010. So that was in a way, the sort of practical side of it is that when I took on the deanship at Princeton, it just was pretty much impossible for me to be a kind of full-time partner in field operations with Jim Corner, and Jim and I came to a kind of amicable split. I mean, we had won the Fresh Skills competition, and we won a little competition for a garden in New York that was built. I didn't want to completely redefine myself as a landscape architect. And so, because I'd always done houses and buildings, throughout this period of time. And the sort of conceptual background of landform building was to say, how can I take all of these lessons from landscape about the sort of connectivity by surfaces, about the open-endedness of program, about the ability to adapt and change over time, and make it work at the scale of a building. How can you recover the agency of architecture in the context of landscape, as opposed to working strictly as a landscape architect? So we held a conference here at Princeton University, and then put together this book with Lars Mueller that was a kind of a statement about the agency of buildings that could perform like landscapes without dissolving, without losing their objecthood and dissolving into the landscape, right? And so I think that in a certain way laid the groundwork for a return on my part to working with smaller scale buildings that are sort of more object-like. So, and then, 10 years later to the book called Situated Objects. Everyone's day-to-day routine was upended by the pandemic. But basically, when I stepped down from the deanship, I made a decision on the one hand to sort of downsize my practice. At that point, I was running a fairly large, not large, but an office with 5 or 6 people in Brooklyn, and doing projects in Asia, spending time on airplanes. And, we did this master plan for the reuse of the municipal airport in Taichung, and did a number of other urban scale and planning projects in Asia. And I frankly was not getting huge amount of satisfaction from that work. So I made the decision to kind of refocus the practice in some ways sort of back to the origins, working with artist clients. And 2 hours north of New York City in the Hudson River Valley, there's a big community of artists, either they're full-time or part-time. And I'd done a house for an artist, a friend of mine up there, and then she invited me back to add a studio onto that, and that led to another studio for another artist, and houses for collectors. And so, in a fairly sort of organic way, the idea of relocating the practice to the Hudson River Valley, working with this sort of local community of artists and collectors, has sort of emerged out of that. So essentially the work that's collected in Situated Objects, that in the earliest project goes back to 2012, really represents that work. And it coincides with the time that I stepped down from the deanship and closed my office in Brooklyn and sort of cut my ties with doing large-scale urban work and landscape work. So, I would say that I remain connected to and interested in cities and landscape, but more from the point of view of writing about cities and landscape rather than, working. I think the other thing, which is, it's in its own way fascinating about doing a large-scale landscape project, is it's by definition highly collaborative and interdisciplinary. And you're working with hydraulic engineers and soil engineers and civil engineers and landscape people and plant people. But I just, at that point in my life, became a little bit less interested in that kind of collaboration and more interested in working with these smaller scale projects where you're engaging a kind of rural landscape in a very, very kind of direct way. I mean, part of the argument of the book Situated Objects is none of these buildings are freestanding object buildings in a landscape. They are always in relationship to existing structures, existing histories, existing landscapes. In many cases, they are additions to other buildings, or they're additions like in proximity to other buildings. And it's really, a kind of suggestion that, I mean, I would say situated objects is still a critique of the object building per se, but it's almost an argument that says that, any building is always going to be in a kind of complex dialogue with its site, and it's sort of paying attention to the space between the building and the site. Yeah, I mean, look, I belong to a generation that was taught by people like Peter Eisenman and Raphael Moneo or even, I mean, figures like Aldo Rossi, so that idea of a kind of written reflection on the discipline has been sort of fundamental to me right from the beginning. I mean, I do insist that writing and designing are different techniques. They occupy different parts of your brain, and I mean, day to day, I tend to sort of write in the morning and design in the afternoon, I mean, I think, for example, I mean, there are, I don't know, you could talk about the structure of an essay, the composition of an essay as being similar in some ways to the design of a project, but I think it's a mistake to see too much cross influence. I see them as parallel tracks that have in common the fact that they're done by the same person, but I don't think you should hold design up to the model of the writing or writing up to the model of design in a way. You have to let each one of them find its own logic. But so yeah, I mean, also, I mean, I think particularly in the last 10 years, I think to think about writing less as an academic exercise and more as a kind of creative pursuit in its own right in certain ways, to that the things I'm writing are more essayistic and personal reflections rather than long sort of academic pieces full of footnotes. I mean, I'm just not very interested in that kind of writing these days. So yeah, that is important to me. But it also, I don't know. I mean, it's harder for me to think of sort of younger figures that are equally committed to design and writing. So maybe a dinosaur in that regard. Well, again, in the American context, or the Anglo-American context, I don't think it's an accident that the most innovative schools are not associated with universities. So basically, SciArc, the AA, and Cooper Union are all independent schools of architecture. Cooper Union, of course, is associated with an art school. So, and RISD, the first place I ever took architecture courses, is an art school. So yeah, those are two very different trajectories, and yeah, I mean, the schools of architecture associated with the universities, such as Princeton, obviously, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Berkeley, UCLA, they are subject to the protocols of the university, and they do function very, very differently. And I think, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, I mean, SciArc didn't exist until the 70s, but and I would say through the 80s, schools like Cooper, the AA, and SciArc, there was a kind of freedom that you wouldn't have found in a university-associated school of architecture. So yeah, that's very true. That's very true. I think in the United States, there is a bigger gap between the professional culture of architecture and the academic culture of architecture. That, particularly, the situation I'm most familiar with is Spain, and this is, again, I was in Spain in the 80s, so before the famous Bologna Accords and the standardization of the European curriculum. And the drawings that a Spanish architecture student would make in the 1980s for their proyecto fin de carrera, you could give to a contractor and build the building, So on the one hand, the schools were more dedicated to training in the craft of making architecture, and then the discipline itself maintained more of that connection back to the culture of the schools. Whereas what's happened, particularly I think over the past 30 years in the US, is that the academic culture in the US has become very, very specialized, and of course, it's working in many ways at a very, very high level, but it's very disconnected from the culture of practice. And the culture of mainstream practice, for its own right, has no interest in what's happening in the schools. So that for me is a major, again, the Latin America situation, I don't know as well, but that's a major difference that I would find with the European schools. I think it's actually a huge benefit for students who come to study here. I think for Europeans, South Americans, people from Asia who come to the US, there's a reason they come to the US, and then of course, the culture of architecture today is operating globally, and people are circulating throughout the world, and there's a kind of exchange of ideas that's happening at many different levels. I think I have somewhat mixed feelings about this. I would not advocate somehow, that American schools should go back to training architects more. I think there are times in which we need to make students understand that making architecture itself can be a kind of intellectual operation, can be an idea-driven operation, that somehow the conceptual world and the world of making are not necessarily separate. I don't think we always do such a good job of that, but I think the freedom that the American schools have is to do what they do very well, to do what they do within the academic context very, very well. And, of course, we're answerable to the profession through, as you mentioned, accreditation and so on. But, frankly, that's not, it's just not a very high bar, right? And it doesn't dictate the curriculum. Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is, I think certain things are actually better learned in the context of practice. And, to that degree, the system that's in place in the US, where you spend 3 years between finishing school and becoming a licensed architect, I think that's appropriate, that you are, essentially, dealing with clients and engineers and professional practice. Sure, we offer classes about that in the university, but you're going to learn that much better, out there in the field, working in an office, So, although I do, there was something, going back to the Cooper context, that Bob Slutsky used to like to say. He would say, because Cooper Union, you have to remember, in the 1970s, had this sort of impression of being this very kind of slightly esoteric place, totally disconnected from the reality of building. And, Hayek had obviously built very little. And, you had people like Raymond Abraham there, people like Danny Libeskind, who came out of Cooper. And Slutsky used to say at Cooper, we're more real than the real world, right? And by which I think he meant that, for one thing, if you if you were interested in innovation, if you wanted to do something more experimental, you actually had to be more precise and more rigorous than simply sort of plugging into the available conventions, right? And that what was happening in a lot of schools that are, the professional schools that are sort of, talk about their engagement with the so-called real world, they simply mean buying into the conventions of the real world. Whereas there was a kind of, in the best of senses, in the kind of experimental ethos of a place like Cooper, was that, if you're gonna do something unconventional, you actually have to be better than anybody else. You have to figure it out yourself, because there's no precedent to work from. So I mean, I think there's an element of that as well, which does sort of belong in a sense to a kind of culture of experimental work and making. So I've always taught studios and seminars, and I particularly, I mean, I think for me the great thing about teaching seminar is that you're really exchanging ideas directly with the students. I mean, I think I've taught, actually, many years ago when I first came to, so Columbia, I always taught upper level studios. And again, something that Shumi encouraged at Columbia was to really treat the studio as a kind of laboratory where you choose a topic and you and the students are investigating the topic together. So I did for a fairly long period of time teach first year studio here, which is something slightly different, where you have an obligation in a sense to introduce students to the language of the discipline and the tools of the discipline. But when I've taught studio at Princeton more recently, it's this sort of upper level studio where for example, that's where I continue to work and speculate on urban issues, is now through studios with the graduate students, right? And that becomes, again, it becomes more of a kind of academic and intellectual exercise as well as a design exercise. So yeah, I've always taught studio, and have been teaching most recently a kind of seminar for the post-professional students who come into Princeton's program, which is really about students situating themselves within the discipline. So in other words, treating these graduate students who already have professional degrees in architecture as young architects who are, where are they going to position themselves in the field today? What are the issues? What does the landscape of the field look like? In some ways, many of the questions you're asking me, who are their influences? Who are their mentors? And how do they process that influence to produce something that's their own? I mean, I think the transition from the school to practice and finding strategies to keep some of the sort of openness and creativity of the sort of academic world present in, when you have to deal with clients and codes and budgets and contractors who don't want to do the project the way you want to do it, and to realize that, it's on the one hand, you can't realize work if you're not willing to deal with all of those issues. But sometimes you can get so wrapped up in the minutia of everyday practice that you lose sight of why you're sort of doing it in the first place. I think it's a difficult transition for everyone to make in a way. For an architect, the next building is always going to be the best one. I don't see, doing anything differently in a way, I mean, I think that's the other thing about architecture that I mean, we are, of course, subject to changing technologies and, I mean, you talked a little bit about, I mean, certainly the way architects communicate with one another is different, and the way that information is exchanged is different. But, in many ways, what we do is still pretty kind of fundamental, I just, I mean, it's the other thing which is, I think, in a way, very attractive about the profession is that architects just keep working, You think of architects who've done significant work in their, 60s, 70s, 80s, Oscar Niemeyer, still building at age 100, So I, I mean, I think that's how I see the future.